Uh, Welcome to this lecture. As you remember, in the previous one, we were discussing how the debate between Anglicists and the Orientalists was settled in favor of English. But before reaching that conclusion, let's see what goes into the making of that decision. How do the British actually make that decision? One very important part of making the decision was this letter written by Ram Mohan Roy in December 1823 that is talking about introducing modern education in India. If you remember, that was one of the problems for the colonial government, that how do we think about balancing our project of educating Indians with these competing forces of Anglicists, Christian evangelists, and also the Orientalists. Now, Ram Mohan Roy, and it's very important for us to understand Roy's position here. Roy, as many of you know, has been variously described as the father of Indian modernity and harbinger of Bengal Renaissance. Roy was a polymath and a polyglot. Roy knew many languages, was very well educated. There is this wonderful story recounted in Arvind Mehrotra's edited History of Indian English, uh, where we are told about this incident in Bhagalpur, where Roy makes a very famous entry. Roy, as the Diwan, is crossing by the recently appointed district collector, and we only have fragments of the event that is there. Let me reconstruct the event for you. By a brick lane, the newly appointed collector is standing, ordering his people to do some work, and at this time, a palanquin crosses in which Roy is sitting. He's the Diwan. It's being carried by bearers, and we have two versions that are there. In one version, the collector says that he passed without even paying any attention towards the collector, and when the collector confronts him, he behaves in not such an honorable manner. This is the collector's version. Roy writes a letter to the then Viceroy Lord Minto about this, says that as it was a dusty road, the palanquin doors were almost closed, so he could not see who's around, and his bearers informed that the collector is there. Once he came to know that the collector was there, by the time he had crossed him, he came down to offer his obeisance to the collector, but then the collector reportedly abused him. Now, in writing this letter to Lord Minto, and this is written in the kind of idiom that you see here in this letter also, where he knows how to use the language of colonial governance, he reports this misbehavior by the British official. But what is important is that what Roy chooses to underscore here. Roy chooses to underscore a very important thing, that I went to pay my obeisance to him, my respects to him, but he abused me. I am paraphrasing the letter here, saying that why didn't you pay your respects to me properly? Probably he was expecting a Mughal feudal kind of a relationship between both of us, where I pay my salam to him in the way that the Mughal courtiers expected it to be, which I think the British don't want. So what Roy does is a very interesting maneuver, where he says that the British champion themselves in bringing modernity, bringing modern ways of governmentality, where the relationship between the subject and the ruler is different than the feudal world of the Mughal Darbar. If you are championing that, then why is this officer asking me to do the same kind of salam that was expected in a Mughal court? So thereby what he is doing is that in feigning innocence, that like, oh look, I didn't know that you expected me to do that kind of a salam, I'll do it. But I thought the British government had stopped those kinds of outdated and feudal ways of marking one's honor and reputation. So he underlines the hypocrisy, he underlines the gap that is there on paper and what is happening on ground. But more importantly, what he underlines is that a native can speak back to the colonial government. That in writing this letter, he is marking himself as an Indian subject. And look, I'm using the word Indian here very deliberately, because remember the title, right? And I said that Indian, the notions of being Indian change. He's constructing a very new subjectivity here, because this is a subject who knows English, can write a letter to the British government, matching or even bettering the proficiency of the collector in those letters, and then talk to them in their own language, asking for justice. A principle enshrined in the discourse of colonial ideology itself, that they are here to dispense justice, they are here to they are here for law and order, which was not there in India before their arrival on the shores. So what Roy does is almost to construct a new subjectivity for Indians, that you know that you can speak or probably get heard in the British court, in the British administration, if you know their idiom. And this is probably can be thought as the arrival of the modern Indian in that sense, an Indian who knows and understands colonial governmentality, who also knows the rules and who can ask for his or her rights. So thereby, Roy initiates a very interesting phase of Indian very interesting phase of India and English. And that gives me a very good context for us to discuss this letter, where he is asking for modern education. What I highlight is, after the initial, like if you see these till these lines, it's like he pays respect, and the usual Victorian 19th century kind of obsequious language, Then he says very interestingly, and this is where I bring in the Bhagalpur incident to play alongside. The present rulers of India, coming from a distance of many thousand miles to govern a people whose language, literature, manner, customs, and ideas are almost entirely new and strange to them, cannot easily become so intimately acquainted with their real circumstances as natives of the country are themselves. So, what he is trying to tell us is that though the British are the present rulers of this country, they probably may not understand our languages, manners, customs, and ideas because these are very new and strange things to them. And probably he is also highlighting that now that there is no Orientalist thrust in that sense, so probably the gap is much bigger. So, almost entirely new and strange to them cannot easily become intimately acquainted with their real circumstances as the natives of country themselves are. So, what he is asking almost from the beginning itself that like probably because you will not understand how this country works or how we go about our language, manners, and customs and ideas, it's probably better also to listen to the natives in terms of policy making. And he is referring to the bone of contention here is that 1 lakh rupees in the Charter Act that is there. That if the discussion is that 1 lakh rupees are to be given, for what it should be given. And therefore, he says that before making a decision, you please hear us. He continues, we should therefore be guilty of a gross dereliction of duty to ourselves and afford our rulers just ground of complaint at our apathy. Did we omit on occasion of importance like this to supply them such accurate information as might enable them to devise and adopt measures calculated to be beneficial to the country and thus second by our local knowledge and experience declared benevolent intentions for the improvement. So, what he is telling us that like if we don't tell you, you may later think that we have not done our duties. It might be considered as dereliction of duty. We are risking almost a dereliction of duty if we remain silent. So, therefore, will not be silent is what he is saying. Therefore, I am writing the letter, the justification of writing this letter, because this is a very important moment and Roy understands the significance of this moment. And he says that a considerable sum of money is to be annually devoted to the instruction of its Indian subject. So, we were filled with sanguine hopes that this sum would be laid out in employing European gentlemen of talent and education to instruct the natives of India in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences which the nations of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that has raised them above the inhabitants of other parts of the world. One very important thing that I also mentioned in the last lecture, which is very important to highlight here at the beginning of this letter itself, is that many times, rather conveniently, Roy has been accused that he was asking for English education. However, as you can see right from here and then till the end of this letter, you will see that he does not ask for English education. What he is asking is that he is saying that we thought when these schools and colleges were established, we thought the government will bring in European gentlemen, people who are trained there, and they will come here and train us in these subjects. Subjects like mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences, as you can see. So, he is asking for modern education as we think about it. That how do we have modern education? We don't want to, in other words, we don't want that sum of 1 lakh rupees to be set aside for revival of knowledge. If you remember two phrases that were there was the revival and then of the learned native, of improvement of learned native. He wants the improvement, and that's why he wants that people trained in Europe will come here and teach us these things. Things like mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences, which the nations of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that has raised them above the inhabitants of other parts of the world. In a way, what he is doing, he is again, like the Bhagalpur letter, he is holding the colonial government accountable. That if you have come under the pretext that you are supposed to bring light to us, you are supposed to bring modernity to our world, let that be the case, that we should be looking at bringing modernity. But that's what he's saying is not happening because the government is establishing Sanskrit schools under Hindu Pandits to impart such a knowledge that is already current in India. That what is the point then of already doing something that is there in India? Sanskrit knowledge is already there in India. What we need, and Roy more than any of the Indians understands this at this point, because as I was recounting the Bhagalpur incident to you, Roy already understands this. So, therefore, he is in opposition in that sense to the Orientalist, because his objective, unlike the Orientalist, is not towards benefiting the colonial government. If the Orientalists were mapping India through their proficiency in Indian languages and Oriental languages, Roy does not have those objectives, because Roy's objectives are that we should step into the modern world like Europeans have, and they have made considerable progress. So, therefore, we should be imparted modern education, not Sanskrit education, which we already have. And he goes on to, and this letter is a very interesting exercise in rhetoric, whereby he, and it's very easy to see Roy's proximity to the Anglicists, who are also championing that if we want to give modern education to where the Orientalists, the Anglicists are only one step ahead, which we will see in Macaulay's minutes, that if we want to give modern education in India, following Roy, we should do it in English, very simply. But Roy is not making that connection yet, that this modern education can only be imparted in English. What he is against is that the entire education being focused on imparting Sanskrit knowledge, because he says that the pupils will there acquire what was known 2000 years ago with the addition of vain, empty subtleties since produced by speculative men, such is already commonly taught in all parts of India. Already we are teaching this. If you are establishing schools to teach the same thing again, but you mentioned that you are supposed to teach modern education, you are supposed to impart modern education, but you are teaching us what is already known for 2000 years in India itself, then what is the point of this colonial exercise? And then he goes on to discuss why is it such a problematic thing. He goes on to tell us that Sanskrit language, and here he is using the utilitarian discourse that is very popular in England at this point of time, popularized by Jeremy Bentham and taken over by J.S. Mill and others. The same utilitarian logic that will be also deployed by Macaulay in his famous Minutes. So, if you see the paragraphs after this, he goes on to discuss the Sanskrit language, the difficulty of learning Sanskrit language, and for how it will take so many years. If students learn Sanskrit, they are only asked to uh, go through outdated instructional setups. So, that is why he says, and mockingly, for instance, in learning to discuss the Vyakarana of Sanskrit grammar, what they do is like such points as the following: khad signifying to eat, khadati, she or he eats. Query: whether does the word khadati taken as a whole convey the meaning he, she or it eats, or are the separate parts of this meaning conveyed by distinct portions of the word? He is thinking about Sandhi and Samas at this point, and he gives a parallel for the English audience to understand, as if in English language it were asked how much meaning is there in the eat and how much is in the s, eats, if it is eat or s, and the whole meaning of the word is conveyed by those two portions of it distinctively or by jointly. So, he is mocking obviously the Sanskrit scholarship and the kind of pedagogy that is going on. What Roy has in mind and is asking for is that let us not spend the considerable amount of government energy and money in these kinds of exercises. Let us put it to better use in something else. So, therefore, what he asks to do is for the student to learn something else, and that is why he says that the student cannot be said to have improved his mind after he has learned into how many ideal classes the objects in the universe are divided and what speculative relation the soul bears to the body and the body to the soul and the eye to the ear. So, he is saying that the current Sanskrit pedagogy is restricted only to, and then he is talking about the orthodoxy of pedagogy here, that the entire focus is on grammar and metaphysics, nothing of the sciences. That Sanskrit scholarship is not invested enough on the sciences itself or any other kind of modern knowledge systems which are prevalent in other parts of the world. And you see a very internationalist bent in Ram Mohan Roy, where he is constantly comparing the Indian education system to the European one. That look, in Europe this is what people are learning, but here we are learning this only. So, therefore, it is very important that we learn what our European compatriots are reading and learning, so that we will actually come to terms with them. We will be at the same level with them. We probably can on some day be equal to them. So, therefore, he draws attention again to the lack of scientific inquiry and lack of science in pedagogy that is prevalent in India at this point of time. And he says, probably that is what he is suggesting and saying, that we expected better from you. You said that you will bring in rational inquiry, scientific inquiry to Indian minds, but you are investing in Sanskrit education which is not discussing this kind of a rational and practical and scientific inquiry. So, that is why he urges, in order to enable your leadership to appreciate the utility of encouraging such an imaginary as characterized above, I beg your leadership will be pleased to compare the state of science and literature in Europe before the time of Lord Bacon and the progress of knowledge we have made since he wrote. He says that, look, if you compare what was there before Renaissance and after what happened, that the scientific inquiry coming in, rational spirit being encouraged, and the pedagogy being overhauled, if you look at that and if you look at our state, then you will realize the difference. Because before the Renaissance rational spirit, Europe was also stuck in looking at metaphysics and looking at rote learning and all that. He's asking that let's not do that. If it is intended, if it had been intended to keep the British nation in ignorance of real knowledge of the Baconian philosophy, in the same manner, the Sanskrit system of education would be best calculated to keep this country in darkness if such had been the policy of the British legislature. So, one can see how easily by demolishing the Orientalist claims, Roy is making space for the Anglicists to take over. Because that's the only other available alternative that is there for the government at this point of time. And Roy, though is not talking about English education, Roy is talking about modern education. He, in a way, asks for English education to be promoted in India, because his arguments are more in support of the Anglicist than the Orientalists. So, as you will see, he concludes by saying that the government, the improvement of the native population is the object of the government. And remember, when he is saying this, when the improvement of the native population is the object of the government, he is almost harping back on what we read in Gauri Vishwanathan, where Vishwanathan was telling us about how it is important to learn, how it is important for Warren Hastings that the happiness of the native is about our care should result in happiness of the native population. He is holding the government accountable to that kind of accountability, that the ideology of the colonial government should, and if the professed ideology is that the improvement of the native population is what is supposed to be done, then the only way it will be improved is by bringing in modern education, and therefore that the sum proposed of 1 lakh rupees, what needs to be done? He is talking about an entire pedagogical framework that employing a few gentlemen of talents and learnings educated in Europe, and providing a college furnished with necessary books, instruments and other apparatuses. So, if we do that, then we are looking at a kind of a modern education. We bring in people from Europe who are well trained in modern sciences, natural history, as he says, the names of the disciplines that he takes: mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy and other useful sciences. We bring them here, we ask them to teach our students so that the improvement of the native population takes place. And he says that this is, I'm expressing and I'm doing my duty in representing this subject. I'm doing my duty. What you see again, and then this is very important to highlight in terms of Ram Mohan Roy, that you start seeing that Roy has already established a relationship of the citizen here, that he is a citizen of this country who has some stake in the policies itself, that we will decide the policy that is there. So, as a conscious and conscientious citizen, he is asking for certain things to be done so that it will benefit the government, and almost in a way he pricks the government also, by exposing that you probably have no ground realities when you have no ground realities to rely on when you are framing policies. So please take, and he's also probably pointing to the fact that probably natives are not part of policy making decisions which they are supposed to be, because you are making policies essentially about us. It's only few of you who are probably divorced from reality are making policies for us, and therefore that's why he highlights it in the beginning as well as till the end, that look, you come from far, you have no real understanding of us in that sense. That's what he says here, and he's almost repeating the same thing towards the end, that look, if the improvement is the real concern, then you guys are not doing it well at this point. So he's constantly poking holes also into the colonial enlightenment ideology, also poking holes into the British machinery itself, and is also telling them that that please understand what is beneficial for us. So thereby he is highlighting obviously the case for a modern education. He's also constructing the modern individual, the modern Indian individual. The modern is necessarily associated here with access to English. That because he has access to English, and it's very important to understand in the context of this letter, that because he has access to English, he can ask for a role of a citizen, ask for a role as a participant. He can also, by couching his attack a servile manner, he is like, oh, I am a servant of the colonial government, but he's also attacking the government that, like, look, you are not framing policies as per the need of the hour and also the subject. So therefore you need to be mindful of our needs. So what he inaugurates in that sense, the modern Indian individual, because the modern Indian individual will have access to English, and that's what we'll see constantly through this course, through the texts, various texts that we'll read, that this definition of this modern Indian individual will keep changing, but it will be necessarily linked to their access to English itself, which Ram Mohan Roy inaugurates in one way. We'll stop here for this lecture, and we'll continue in this discussion in the next lecture itself.